Thank you, dear President Zoe Constantopoulou. Thank you, Sofia Sakurafa. Thank you, Eric Toussaint. And thanks to everyone who is collaborating and participating on this such important initiative, not only for Greece, for the world. Well, the first step of a debt audit is the document analysis. So, since I arrived here in Greece, I've been fully at disposal of the True Committee and dedicated my time to read word by word the agreements that are ruling the Greek debt since 2010. They are written on a very confused way, a illogical sequence. And some parts of the text are missing. As I started to summarize the main ideas in each paragraph, some mechanisms started to show up, as I'm going to present you. This is a preliminary work, I must say, because we are based on texts found on official web pages. So far, we have not received the signed complete copies. But the copies we found in official web pages could already show the main steps inserted on these agreements. Everyone knows, since 2010, the banks were the ones who got bailout, not Greece. The analysis of the mechanisms show how this was done. The revelation of the mechanisms show how the majority, almost all borrowed funds went straight to the banks, transferred to financial institutions instead of Greece. The mechanisms use complex tools and manners to hide and obscure the real functioning and the real purpose of the agreements. In these 15 minutes I have, I will be able to give you only an idea of such mechanisms, but they are better summarized in our report. And I also will give you, Eric, Sophia, and President Zoe, a complete copy of all work I've been developing to figure out those mechanisms. I really hope this work will be useful for this Parliament and for Greek government, especially in this time, to face the illegal and illegitimate system that is submitting Greece. No other country in the world has a better condition and a better chance to do it right now. And if Greece faces the system, Greece will enforce its role and its symbol for ethic values, right, and democracy, references that are so significant for humankind. Well, the first mechanism, the first aspect I must highlight is that the set of agreements we studied were not a Greek initiative. Those agreements were organized by the Troika, the European Commission, the ECB, and the IMF. They didn't benefit Greece, but they provided the tools for the generation of a great amount of debts toward bilateral creditors, towards EFSF, besides the creation of other liabilities and obligations, and abusive costs. All costs are borne to Greece. They deepened the debt crisis. At the same time, those agreements provided the acceleration of the privatization in Greece and enabled the transformation of public assets on ways for paying debt. all these agreements analyzed were attached to the memorandums that so destructively affected Greeks' economy and people's life. The first mechanism I'll present is under the so-called bilateral agreement. The mechanism inserted on the bilateral agreement was hidden. It was hidden on an annex where we found another agreement. So inside an annex, there was another new agreement. This new agreement allowed the transformation of a bondholder in a new party on the agreement. A bondholder could receive the funds lent by the bilateral creditors, the 14 European countries and the German bank, the KfW, because we must notice that Germany is not a party on the loan agreement. The bank, KfW, is a party on behalf of Germany. So, by applying these mechanisms, the money borrowed by bilateral creditors didn't come to Greece. How could this happen? The mechanism used an account opened in the ECB for processing payments related to the agreement. At the recalculation date would coincide the maturity of debt securities held mainly by private banks and the disbursement of the loan by the countries. Before what they call balancing date, all amounts deposited in such account in ECB would go straight to the new parties on the agreement, the bondholders. This is very hidden in the copy we could find of this bilateral agreement. By applying such mechanism, the 2010 agreement generated bilateral debts by creating this mechanism that provided the transformation of the bonds in hands of the banks into bilateral loans. The revelation of this mechanism puts down the discourse that taxpayers from those countries are financing Greece. They are not. In reality, they financed the private banks that held the far below value existing debt securities. Greek statistics prove there has been a total transformation on the ownership of public debt from securities in 2010, around 200 billion euros, to loans in 2014, around 227 billion euros. Another set of agreements came to Greece in 2012 under the Master Facility Agreement that complement many agreements and many mechanisms. The creditor in those 2012 agreements is the EFSF, already presented, the European Financial Stability Facility. It's a private company, a Société Anonyme, based in Luxembourg, created in 2010 to guarantee financial stability in Europe. But in reality, EFSF is functioning as a special vehicle that uses funding instruments, papers, guaranteed by the European countries. These guaranteed papers end up supporting private banks. At the same time, the toxic assets the banks had are being addressed to public sector. We can see that on the Bank of Greece off-balance sheets. The creation of EFSF was an imposition of IMF, which gave to EFSF a support of 250 billion euros. This would be illegal, but IMF chose exchange its own statute to allow this. The EFSF could delegate the management of all funding activities. The board of directors could delegate their functions. The member states could delegate the decision-making related to the guarantors to the Eurogroup working group. At that time, such working group didn't even have a full-time president. In fact, the German Debt Management Agency is providing support to EFSF. This information is in the website of EFSF. Although EFSF is the major Greek creditor in all mechanisms we could disclose, EFSF didn't send money to Greece, but funding instruments, papers. The first mechanism I'll present has been applied on the program Recapitalization of Financial Institutions. This mechanism utilizes the Hellenic Fund Stability Facility, HFSF. It's a totally, purely private fund created by imposition of IMF in 2010. And to guarantee support to private banks in Greece. We must not confound EFSF, the Luxembourg company, with the HFSF, the Hellenic Fund, okay? The mechanism shows how the EFSF loan benefit the banks. It starts with EFSF issuing funding instruments, negotiated, for example, in the Luxembourg bourse, as we could prove. EFSF disburses the loan by delivering those financial instruments to the Hellenic Private Fund through the Bank of Greece. Greek private banks issue a paper with no guarantee, using the name of Greek bank instruments. And the Hellenic Private Fund buys those papers, using the funding instruments that had been received from EFSF. The operation benefits only exclusively the Greek private banks, while an obligation to Greece reflected on a new loan with EFSF is generated. Besides, other obligations are created because the private Hellenic Fund issues securities, and the Bank of Greece will pay interest and fees and everything in favor of EFSF. Observe that the instruments issued by EFSF, the funding instruments guaranteed by the European countries, ended up on the private banks when the Hellenic Fund used them to buy the Greek banking instruments. And these Greek banking instruments without guarantee came to Greece. Greece doesn't get any benefit, but a great loss. At least 48.2 billion euros has been received by the Hellenic Private Fund. 48.2 billion euros has been received by the Hellenic Private Fund by this mechanism to apply in recapitalization of financial private banks. How can this type of debt be sustainable? A debt with no benefit for the country, that just passed through the Bank of Greece and the Hellenic Private Fund and served the private banks. How Greece can afford it? How any country can afford this? And pay back in cash, not only the principal, but interests, costs, fees, and other obligations that it generates. Another mechanism is applied on the program, the PSI. EFSF issues EFSF debt securities, a paper again. The operation is co-financed by international banks, instructed by the British Wilmington Trust London Limited. They issue, in name of Greece, international bonds with many legal restrictions, so that those bonds cannot be negotiated in any legitimate stock market. They don't obey the SEC and the international rules for state sovereign bonds. They use the name of new Greek bonds for these international restricted bonds that could be issued on an amount up to 70 billion euros. These instruments, the EFS instruments and the international bonds, are utilized together to exchange existing debt securities obligations under the PSI program, generating financial damage not only to Greece, but generating a new debt towards EFSF. It's important to highlight that at the same time some small creditors suffered the haircut, as Leonidas Vatikiotis just told us. The PSI represented a great profit for international investors. Another mechanism is about the buyback of those international restricted bonds. The buyback program was about these international Greek restricted bonds. Greece bought those bonds back, generating more debts towards EFSF. And this buyback operation has the participation of the ECB. So more obligations towards ECB are generated in this mechanism. Through this mechanism, that also took an expanding automatic course, because the agreements introduced the rollover, the refinancing, the renewing, the recycling of previous operations. Which interests this mechanism serve? Again, only the private sector. As I told, the agreements also accelerated the privatization process. We know the ownership of strategic assets and profitable public enterprises has always been the prime objective of the elite private sector. Such objective has been satisfied by the debt system, which functions not only as the justification to oblige the selling out of state properties to pay debts, but those 2012 agreements authorized private special companies or funds to issue securitization notes, a paper. In this paper, the securitization notes are being used not only to accelerate the privatization process here, but also to pay debt to EFSF. This way, the debt towards EFSF generated through these illegitimate mechanisms is being paid with public Greek assets. By utilizing another structure created under the memorandum determination, the Hellenic Republic Asset Development Fund, HARAD. This one has no transparency in its website. But we could find out the securitization notes are structured over shares in state-owned companies, land and buildings, natural gas storage rights, economic rights, voting rights, or other assets or rights which would be privatized. So, at the end, the securitization notes accelerated the privatization process, and Greece state assets are transformed into a payment method to EFSF. After analyzing those mechanisms inserted in the agreements, what Greece really owns? This is the question. What Greece really owns? Greece didn't benefit from those agreements. They served private sector. They generated a current outstanding debt of 183 billion euros towards bilateral creditors and EFSF. Besides, they created other liabilities, abusive costs, and accelerated the privatization process. They submit Greece to abusive clauses, governance under English law, English court, where Greek constitution has no value, it's not considered. They represent humiliation and lack of sovereignty, a tremendous damage to Greece and the population due to the immeasurable cost submitting the country that represents so much for humanity. Greece has counted on a private advisor for such disastrous negotiations. The agreements mandate Greece to have a legal private advisor. It was the Cleary, Gottlieb, Steen, and Hamilton. This firm is very known in Latin America for its advice on the transformation of odious and lapsed external debt into new bonds under the Brady Plan. This Brady Plan represented a disaster for many Latin American countries, as have been proven during the official audit debt in Ecuador and the parliamentarian investigation we had in Brazil. These preliminary findings demonstrate the importance of further investigations and audit procedures over these mechanisms. We must denounce this debt system. We've had enough of exploitation from national and international financial sector, submitting our countries and our peoples. It's time for the truth to prevail. The time to put human rights, democracy, and ethic values over all lower interests. And this task is a Greek task. I offer this work for you. Thank you.
Ευχαριστούμε την Maria Lucia Fattorelli.
We thank Maria Lucia Fattorelli for all her work, for all her efforts, and for everything she has said. And I would like to particularly thank her for the way in which she spoke about Greece the other day during the hearing of the former Greek representative to the IMF, Mr. Roumeliotis, when she, in the most illustrative manner, decoded what it means as a symbol and symbolism, what Greece means as a symbol and symbolism, its identification with the democracy, the reference to democracy, reference to value of democracy, and the symbolism of killing democracy.